1. Olivia Markham had just ordered her first beer of the night when the young Canadian tourist watching the World Cup alone in the noisy lobby of the Hilton Vienna got a phone call. Olivia sat forward, alert. Perhaps it was the online predator who was grooming the girl. She waited for her subject to swipe her smartphone's screen and answer, resisting the impulse to press her Bluetooth earwig more firmly into her ear. The eavesdropping program worked, and she knew it. A brusque male voice sounded in Olivia's ear.
Melissa.
That sure didn't sound like Melissa's lovely middle-aged auntie. Olivia slipped her own smartphone from her messenger bag and glanced around the crowded seating area before routing the incoming number through a trace program. None of the other hotel patrons, either fans of the German team or drunken conference attendees, looked her way. A quick, tight grin flitted across Olivia's face. Though she could attract more than her fair share of attention in an evening gown on stage, she had been blessed with the ability to hide in plain sight when necessary. The young woman, only 17 if Olivia's intel could be trusted, drew male stares, however. That was by design, unfortunately. Tall and dressed in a white silk blouse with an open network of bands across her back, the foolish Melissa wore red lipstick too mature for her age and ordered mixed drinks freely from the bar. Not illegal in Vienna, where the drinking age was only 16, Olivia reminded herself, yet not exactly wise behavior. So far, she'd socialized only with her fellow tour members, who drifted to their rooms half an hour ago. But the longer she remained in the lobby by herself, the more likely she'd pick up a companion, suitable or not. Unless the predator, who called himself Asmodeus, lured her out of the hotel first. Asmodeus. A demon's name. "Hey," Melissa said, blushing and twisting into her armchair. Definitely 17, Olivia thought. "I was afraid you'd never call. I'm getting lonely." She swiveled and gave the crowd around her an appraising look. "No, I see a couple of guys here who look like they'd buy me a drink if I asked." Olivia clenched her lips around an exasperated sigh. She couldn't understand why the teen's aunt had left her to her own devices in a foreign hotel. Oh, she'd heard the girl, her posture confident and her tone assured, explaining to the retired couples traveling on the same bus tour with her that she'd already interned with a Canadian government agency and traveled extensively for the past 2 years. Olivia wasn't buying it, though. Despite her smooth words and relaxed demeanor, Little Miss Ontario was not the savvy world traveler she thought she was. In many areas of life, faking it until you make it led to success with flying colors. But Olivia knew all too well the terrifying consequences when you got in over your head. She'd so wanted to shake the grandparents, fawning over the teen's apparent poise and ambition. Would they be there to save her when she'd gotten herself into trouble because she'd tangled with someone who saw through her puffed-up pretense? Someone like Asmodeus? In the past year, 3 young women who'd had contact with Asmodeus had later gone missing. Olivia had been following him online for 6 months, hoping to catch him in more than innuendos and catfishing. In reality, she had nothing more than a marrow-deep hunch that Asmodeus was a predator, and it was precisely because she couldn't document and quantify the reasons that she knew he was as bad as they come. That was the only thing they had in common, the ability to hide in plain sight. His success at hiding his trail made him all the more dangerous. Worse, he knew it. Olivia had stumbled upon more than one sly joke Asmodeus had left on a comment thread for anyone who cared to notice, arrogant in his certainty that no one recognized the breadcrumbs he left to his crimes. And his chosen moniker? Its mocking conceit drove her crazy. Too bad for Asmodeus that Olivia would never grow cocky and give herself away. And she would never give up.
"You don't want to do that."
His ominous intonation sent a chill down Olivia's spine. But Melissa only laughed. "Why not?"
"I wouldn't like it."
The silky cold response pooled in Olivia's stomach. Melissa laughed again. "Jealous? Serves you right." Olivia wanted to shake her.
"Really?"
There was an unmistakable edge to this single word. "Really?" Melissa said. "You're just some disembodied internet voice." She glanced around the lobby. "I much prefer a warm, flesh-and-blood man."
"You do not want to make me angry, Melissa."
The ingenue sat up and leaned over. An intent, sly expression slid over her young features. Am I? Making you angry, Asmodeus? Bingo. The number came from a cell phone. Now to see if it had a GPS. Olivia's gaze slid toward Melissa. Where in the world had she learned such hardcore seduction? She was playing with Greek fire, the kind that clung to your skin and only spread when you threw water on it. Olivia pressed send on the text she'd already composed to Melissa's aunt. Then she sent a text to the hotel's night manager, who stood at the reception desk waiting for her alert. Catching his gaze, she nodded, and he picked up the phone to call the aunt's room. Provided this delicate dance timed itself well, she'd have enough information on Asmodeus to find him, and Melissa would be safely whisked away before the situation escalated out of Olivia's control.
You are.
The cold anger in Asmodeus's voice lit the banked embers of Olivia's own fury. She tamped tight controls around it. She would channel its energy to take this bastard out.
I don't like games. You've already tried my patience once.
Melissa's tinkling laughter serrated Olivia's nerves. She could only imagine how Asmodeus felt hearing it. Games? What games? I asked you to call me. It's the least you can do to show you're serious.
Oh, I'm serious. Deadly serious. You stopped answering my email. That's a game, Melissa.
Olivia shuddered and studied Melissa, who didn't seem the least bit perturbed by Asmodeus's use of the word deadly. Then again, Melissa thought it was a game, despite her words. An exciting but ultimately harmless game. She couldn't know that Asmodeus was in Vienna right now. She'd always communicated online, and Asmodeus had led the naive girl to think he lived and worked in the States. She told him that she was traveling, never dreaming that he would find her. Never dreaming that she'd spent 4 months flirting with a psychopath who believed he owned her. Olivia fingered the St. Michael medal hanging from a slender chain around her neck. She wouldn't have known Asmodeus was here either, or even who his prey was, if her mysterious source hadn't tipped her off earlier this evening. This was the 3rd time in the 2 months since she'd arrived in Vienna that she'd gotten critical information about sexual predators in an almost preternatural manner. Melissa sat up, anger tightening her features. That's not a game, asshole. That's what happens when you don't give me your cell number. I want to talk to you, not read your cryptic messages. Olivia looked at her smartphone screen. No GPS signal. Likely a burner phone from a big box store. Damn. Now she'd have to hope the call didn't end before she could trace the cell signal back to its source. Biting her lip, she began triangulating Asmodeus's location.
Not only have I called you, I've come for you.
Olivia's gaze flitted to Melissa. The first look of uncertainty crossed the teen's brow. Squinting, she glanced around the Hilton's lobby. Come for me? What do you mean, come for me?
I'm in Vienna, Melissa.
Vienna? The girl's unease sharpened her voice. How did you know I'm in Vienna? Olivia's heart thumped. She'd known her source was accurate, but hearing it from Asmodeus made it real. She prayed he wasn't moving. Walking or driving would make it difficult to get a fix. She peeked at her smartphone again. So far, so good. She traced Asmodeus's cell signal to a Viennese cell tower. Just a few more seconds, and she'd know down to the block where he was.
I know many things. I know you gave your aunt a sleeping pill so you could stay out and have some fun, didn't you?
Guilt slid across the teen's face, only to be replaced with a crafty expression. You remembered that. You remembered that little detail from one of our chats. Her face and body relaxed as she slouched back into the easy chair, with her drink dangling from one hand. Her gaze traveled around the lobby again, but this time she appeared bored. I don't recall telling you I'm in Vienna, but then I say a lot of things to a lot of people I don't remember. There was a short silence. Olivia squeezed her eyes shut. Stupid, stupid girl, doubting herself and providing Asmodeus with a plausible reason for his knowledge. It must be like shooting fish in a barrel for him. He didn't have to work very hard at all with this one.
Do you recall writing that you were dying to meet in person?
Melissa sipped her drink while Asmodeus spoke. Mm-hmm. She nodded and let the empty tumbler dangle again. 5 meters away, A blonde male, gesticulating after a German goal, paused as he caught sight of her. She smiled and wiggled in her seat in such a way that her large breasts rose and fell, and he lowered his arms. He looked back at the large flat-screen TV showing the World Cup, and then looked at Melissa again. I'm just not sure I'm all that impatient right now. As I said, there are other guys right here. She paused. You know what they say.
What's that?
A bird in the hand or some shit like that. Melissa raised her empty tumbler in a salute to the blonde male. Olivia leaned over, placing her left elbow on her thigh, and began rubbing at the dull pain that had started to throb in her forehead. She watched the trace program on the smartphone in her right hand as it bounced from cell mast to cell mast. Any moment, and she'd know how close Asmodeus was.
Melissa,
Asmodeus snarled.
Don't toy with me. I want you to meet me.
Gotcha. Olivia's pulse stuttered and then raced. Asmodeus was somewhere in the block. Crap. She looked up at the oblivious target. Melissa's grip on her phone had gone slack. She seemed transfixed by the blonde fan, whose athletic physique suggested that he did more than watch soccer on TV. No, you meet me. I'm happy where I am. She lifted the smartphone from her cheek and swiped at its screen. Smiling, she leaned forward and set it on the coffee table in front of her and jiggled the empty tumbler at her admirer, who stood up and walked toward her. Right. So the ant was a no-go, but Mr. World Cup would likely keep Little Miss Ontario occupied long enough for Olivia to hunt Asmodeus down. All she had to do was send him a text from Melissa's number, saying she was sorry, JK, LOLs, and all that, and then offer to meet him across the street in the Stadtpark, in front of the Schubert statue in 15 minutes. That done, Olivia glanced at the couple ordering drinks before snatching up her messenger bag. Once outside the Hilton, which sat at the northeast corner of the park, she headed north toward the Weißkirchnerstrasse entrance. At this hour, few pedestrians wandered the sidewalks of Vienna's city center, and there was little traffic on the roads. The concert at the Vienna Salon had ended more than an hour ago, so most concert-goers had likely left, though some might linger over coffee and dessert at the Steyerek restaurant, across the lake from the Schubert Monument. Only the homeless occupied the benches after she crossed the Weinfluss River. That served her purpose as well. Once inside the 19th century English-style park, Olivia hurried down the broad path before veering behind a large tree. In the dark, it would be difficult for any chance passerby to see her clearly as she changed. There was little enough to do to get ready. She already wore a white unitard with a tank-style top and a flowing white chiffon skirt. The layered skirt had a handkerchief hemline that split high in the middle to reveal capri-length leggings, giving her great freedom of movement. She kept her custom-fitted, flat white leather shoes on. Casual from a fashion standpoint, they served her well during her martial arts training. Then she pulled out a pair of white sap gloves lined with Kevlar and weighted with powdered steel from her messenger bag. After tugging the gloves on, she slid a 2-foot baton crafted from a specially tempered stainless steel alloy into a hidden sheath in the back of the tank top. Last, she grabbed a small square of white and black cloth from the bag and tucked it into the space between her breasts. Though dressed and carrying herself like a dancer, no one who saw her would believe her entirely innocuous. She had shed her invisibility at the same time she shed her demure skirt. In her case, however, anyone who saw her would be inclined to limit her threat to that of a femme fatale. She checked the smartphone screen. Asmodeus had replied to her text with a smiley emoticon. She swiped the app to replace her content with something harmless in case someone should find her phone, and dropped it into the messenger bag, which she'd leave under a convenient shrub on her way to the statue. If she got the chance, she'd come back for it. If not, no biggie. Inhaling a deep breath, Olivia consulted her watch. 8 minutes until the rendezvous. As she stepped into the warm night air, Olivia looked up. Stars like finely crushed diamond dust glittered against the blue-black night sky. A hush blanketed the nearly empty park, amplifying distant sounds. Somewhere along the promenade that bordered the Weinfluss River to her left, a woman laughed, a melodic trill followed by the rich baritone of a man's voice. Olivia's step hitched and slowed, and she glanced towards the spontaneous music of seduction. Only lovers strolled at this hour, arm in arm, heads dipped toward one another, whispering hopes and desires. Lovers, spies, and criminals. Pressing her lips together and lifting her chin, Olivia turned away from the voices and strode down the path leading to the west side of the lake, where it was darker and quieter. After she'd gone 15 meters, she swerved behind a large oak and dropped her messenger bag against its trunk. Drawing the square of cloth from her bodice, she shook it out with a flick of her wrist. Then she donned the hood she now held, one modeled on the Japanese zentai head covering. As with typical zentai hoods, hers stretched over her head, face, and neck as a thin fabric skin that obscured her features without restricting sight or breathing. She'd had it made from silk and spandex into a black and white Harlequin mask. Olivia stepped back on the path as her right hand pulled the baton out of its snug sheath on her back. This time, when she flicked her wrist from side to side, each end of the baton extended with an ominous snick. Now she held a high-tech bow with a textured rubber grip in the middle and weighted antenna-like ends. She couldn't help grinning. She should have chosen Darth Maul as inspiration for the design of her hood, since she held the real-world equivalent of a double-bladed lightsaber. Or maybe she should have considered the recent comic book anti-heroine, the Black Sparrow, as a role model. However, Olivia preferred the color white. If any of them could take Black Sparrow as a role model, it would be Beta. Stasia, on the other hand, would be the comic book heroine Miss Fury. Both these sexy, dangerous fictional ladies were drawn wearing black half-masks and catsuits. The next time she met up with her friends, Olivia would tell them about their comic alter egos, though she could hear their pained groans in response. Her friends would, in fact, be quite surprised to learn that she even knew what a superhero was. They had the mistaken impression that she'd grown up on the farm and spent every waking moment spying for the company. Olivia sprinted toward the Schubert statue, her steps soundless. When she arrived, she realized she might have been a bit premature in assuming victory over Asmodeus without a single parry or strike of her bow. It was a failing her sensei had reminded her of each time he stood over her, his own staff angled for a stabbing blow to the throat.
It's not enough to see several steps ahead, Olivia. You must also execute each one.
In the clearing before the seated composer stood the World Cup fan, his forearm around Melissa's throat and his other around her hips. Her head lolled, her dark hair falling to obscure her face. At least he didn't have a weapon. It would have made taking him a challenge. Still, Olivia liked a challenge, because, as she told her sensei, each time she responded to what looked like an impossible situation by finding a way to block or parry him, it wasn't enough to see and execute a series of moves. She also needed to respond and take control. Stopping 5 meters from the silent pair, she kept her feet apart, her left foot forward and her shoulders facing away from the threat. The bow she held in front of her hands gripping the middle third a shoulder width apart in a combat-ready stance. "She's alive?" asked Olivia, nodding toward Melissa. She adopted the husky whisper she'd decided fit her self-imposed role.
For now.
That's when she saw the metallic gleam at Melissa's throat.
But I'm going to liberate her soul.
Is that so? She asked, assessing his hold on Melissa, the intensity in his gaze, the steadiness of his hands. Keep talking, my friend. Maybe she'd like to keep it for a while longer.
That's the problem,
he laughed. Something in the sharp sound brought the hairs on Olivia's nape to attention.
Humans and the Eliud alike cling to this fallen world.
Eliud? Asked Olivia, easing her feet forward a few centimeters. Something about the word sounded familiar, but despite speaking 6 languages fluently and another dozen enough to survive, she had no idea what it meant. He cocked his head.
Don't play coy. I've got eyes.
He tightened his hold on Melissa, who moaned. Olivia decided to change the topic. But not a lot of sense.
What?
There. She'd taken him off guard, and he'd eased his hold on Melissa a bit. The light from the nearby lamppost flashed off something that looked more like an ice pick than a knife blade. Perhaps she could goad him into coming for her. You've got to get past me whether you liberate her soul or not. He smiled and relaxed more.
Not at all. I just have to wait.
That was unexpected. Wait? She asked and lunged, swinging the bow overhand toward his head. He threw his arm up to block the blow, keeping his other arm around Melissa's waist. The bow whipped against his forearm. Olivia heard the distinct snap of breaking bone. He didn't flinch or drop the weapon. Instead, he stepped forward and jabbed it at her face. Olivia jerked back and feinted to the other side, whirling the bow over his head with a whistling sound. He followed her feint, awkward as he held the unconscious teen, and slashing his weapon in front of him. His thrusts met empty air as Olivia sprang to rain blows on his now unprotected torso and back. She connected several times, the weighted disc on the bow's tip cracking against his skull and spine, before dancing away from his thrashing arm. He stood swaying, but didn't collapse. Melissa hung head down over his left arm, her hair and arms swinging. "Why the hell don't you fall down?" Olivia asked, exasperated. He grinned at her. Blood trickled down his earlobe and along the side of his neck. The harsh shadows clinging to the hollows of his face accentuated the evil gleam in his eyes. A faint, sulphurous odor tickled her nose. Olivia charged at him again, both hands gripping the middle third of the bow as she plied the ends against his head and the backs of his thighs. The fury of her onslaught drove him backwards, stumbling. He tripped over the low hedge circling the base of the Schubert monument. As he flung his weapon hand up to try to maintain his balance, Olivia whacked the back of his hand. The weapon dropped and he fell, his legs tangling with Melissa's arms and legs. His free hand scrabbled behind him, but Olivia darted forward and grabbed the weapon before flinging it behind her. It certainly looked like an ice pick. Then she stomped on the back of his hand. Hard. Bones crunched and sinew popped. A sharp whine clawed its way out of his throat. Olivia took 2 quick steps back, swinging the bow down at the same time to rest on his Adam's apple. The grin never left him. The contrast between his expression and the animal sound emanating from his throat brought bile to her mouth and sent a jolt down her spine. Nevertheless, she kept her face impassive and her breathing even. She hadn't even broken a sweat. "Jigs up, Asmodeus." He threw his head back and howled a laugh. At the same time, the high-pitched wail continued to pierce the night. Now, the cold sweat started between her shoulder blades.
"I'm not Asmodeus,"
he said as he looked at her.
"He's waiting for us to capture you."
Olivia stole a glance over her shoulder. A group of men fanned out on the path 5 meters behind her. She'd let herself be distracted and trapped. Another failing her sensei had noted time and again. None appeared armed, but she knew better. She counted quickly. 9. That was going to be a real challenge. "He's going to wait a long time, then," she said, and swiped a low roundhouse kick at the man's head, knocking him out. The eerie, pained sound cut off. Then she jumped to face the silent group, her bow held at the ready. Nodding, she said, "Bring it." Her hoarse voice abraded the still air. One of the men, keeping his gaze on her, bent over and picked up the soccer fan's lost ice pick. Then he stood up and took a step toward her.